Now, Chris, a fellow podcast this week launched some branded merchandise.
Oh, did they really?
So I thought we could have a little brainstorm about what Newscast merch in an ideal fantasy world, non-public service broadcaster world.
Yeah. Swimming trunks?
Why?
Well, why not?
Okay, I was thinking because quite a lot of people listen to us when they're going to bed, so like a Newscast duvet cover.
Yeah, that'd be pretty good. Or one of those face masks.
Yeah. I was also thinking maybe a Newscast plate, so as you're eating your meal, like you see more of your face, and then eventually once you finish your beans on toast, you get the whole Chris Mason.
That is no incentive for people clearing their plates. You can tell us the father of 2 young children who insists on that as much as I can,
Anyway, send us in your ideas. Also, wouldn't it be great if there was a place where you could like download an app and then there was a Newscast community there where you could talk about what we do on the podcast?
BBC Sounds.
And Discord, which is where there is a Newscast community where you can talk about everything on this very podcast. You can download it to your phones and join in all the fun. And we will hopefully give you plenty to talk about on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris in the studio. Hang on a minute, wasn't there a news round annual?
There was 1 year. It was a short-lived project in my old job. My annual writing career didn't take off.
Well, I think, might find that in some bargain bin somewhere in a charity shop.
Anyway, what I was going to say is that this is one of those weeks in Westminster where all the political journalists go to the pub on a Thursday night and go, oh, that was a week, and then talk about all the gossip and everything that happened. So we thought we'd just put that on the podcast.
Yeah.
No drinks, though. These mugs are actually empty, not even water. Anyway, so we've got some fake pub mates with us. We've got Ava Evans from Politics Joe. Welcome back.
Hello, how are we?
And making his Newscast debut, it's Patrick Maguire from The Times. Hello.
Hello, I'm honoured.
If your column's out tomorrow, isn't it?
It is.
Have you written it?
I have.
Okay, good.
It should be going online on the Times website in mere minutes.
Okay, good. I'll click refresh while we're talking. First of all, so the Monday feels like such a long time ago.
Yeah.
And Monday 8:30 a.m. seems a long time ago because that was in the world where James Cleverly was Foreign Secretary and David Cameron was a bit of a has-been, and then David Cameron is again. What was that moment like for you?
Well, actually, Monday morning I was meant to be off. And then I got a very aggressive phone call about 8:42. Where are you? Not there.
Which proves that the reshuffle was a surprise, wasn't it?
I mean, no, because I did actually kind of know at about midnight before I'd gone to bed. And I thought, doesn't matter. They won't start until 11.
Oh, right. You thought it was going to be later. Okay.
Yeah. I also did not think that he was going to sack her. I thought that Sunak would wait. Yes, sorry. I thought that Sunak would wait until Wednesday until we had the Rwanda judgment before sacking Braverman because, of course, it has gone wrong. It hasn't gone in the way that the Conservatives hoped it would. And I would have thought he'd like to pin the blame on that on her.
I think the thing that surprises me is that they managed to keep it secret. I mean, it's such a leaky place. And we now know from David Cameron himself talking to his new team in the Foreign Office that they started chatting about it last Wednesday.
And particularly given that in the interim, it went to the House of Lords Appointments Commission.
Yeah.
So there were plenty of opportunities for it to leak. And given that David Cameron's career after leaving office hasn't been uncontroversial, if there was at some point a Mandarin or House of Lords Appointments Commissioner who cocked a sceptical eyebrow at that, you might have thought it might have made its way to a Sunday newspaper. But it was a total surprise. And let me join Ava in confessing to not necessarily being fully awake at 8:30. And I have tweet notifications on for lots of my esteemed colleagues. Some of them in this very room.
And we should explain newspaper journalists that work later, so they start later.
Well, not on a Sunday. In my defence, I've just fairly recently stopped writing a morning newsletter, so I'm enjoying the concept of sleeping past 5 a.m. But I sort of woke up to a stream of tweet notifications, one of which was just David Cameron with several question marks, and I thought, surely not. But yeah, it was remarkable, especially given that it didn't leak. And if it had leaked, you would have thought it would be one of those stories colleagues put out and you think, oh, that's complete nonsense. We can write that off. It's so outlandish. But no, here we are.
And that was the thing. The fact that it hadn't leaked in this leakiest of leaky postcodes made it a better story because of just the surprise factor. The best kind of news stories, never mind politics, the best kind of news stories are ones where people go, God blimey, look at that. Can you believe it?
And let's be honest.
And it had that. The door opened, he stepped out, and people think, what?
And let's be honest, that will have been part of their calculation in it as well. They didn't just hire him because they thought, oh, he's a big hitter on the world stage. They must have also thought, and this will make everyone go core blimey, which is a good thing in their eyes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, some people go core blimey brilliant, some people go core blimey the opposite. But because he was Prime Minister for 6 years, you know, that kind of people know who he is, which, you know, you wouldn't say about every appointment to Foreign Secretary, even though it's a big gig, because, you know, you rapidly hit diminishing returns amongst political figures in terms of their cut through to the mass of the population most of the time. And, you know, a former Prime Minister ticks that box. So, you know, I mean, what a moment, you know, particularly given, so I was on the radio at the time, in the spare room at home, headphones on, didn't have a screen anywhere near me. So I'm just getting texts from people in government talking to me about what's going on, but then colleagues in the street who were then saying, you know, giving a sense of who was arriving. So I'd gone on the Today programme about 8:20 and said, look, I'm pretty sure a reshuffle's coming, but the problem with the reshuffle when you're reporting it in advance is that it is put-offable and deniable until it's physically happening. Then someone texts me and says, it is on. And then a few minutes later, I get a text saying, basically, wasn't quite this word used, but that Suella Braverman had been sacked. You know, and I'm talking about that on the radio, and you're thinking that's the story we've been anticipating was probably coming soon or soon enough. And then, whilst I'm on the air, I'm getting a text saying, David Cameron's turned up. Like, turned up where? In Downing Street. I'm thinking, is it conceivably possible he could be there for any other reason? It seems unlikely, but not impossible. And then, yeah, you know, that sort of moment of him walking up the street. And I didn't see the pictures, so I didn't see the kind of, when you see the pictures, you think, oh, yeah, this is part of the reshuffle. He's not nipping in to talk about, you know, Alzheimer's research or some of the other stuff that he's done in his post-political career. You know, and then fast forward a few days, and there he is as the face of British foreign policy in Ukraine.
And I don't know the postcode for Kyiv, because that's where he's been today, actually in action as Foreign Secretary. Ava, some people were saying when he was appointed, oh, he's potentially going to upstage Rishi Sunak because he just looks prime ministerial just because he kind of fits the role and had the role. How do you think he looked today? Like the Foreign Secretary or like a Prime Minister?
I think that you've got a very easy job when you head over to Ukraine at the moment, haven't you? I mean, you know, he said something very statesman-like, which was Boris Johnson is not, you know, we've had our disagreements, but I really appreciate what he did in Kyiv. You know, I thought David Cameron looked, you know, the picture of a foreign secretary. And it does feel like he's taken a bit of a deferential role because, you know, he could have stuck around and not gone to Ukraine and talked about the ECHR. I mean, we know that he's had his own battles with the, you know, the human rights courts going back to 2006 when he was Prime Minister. He was very upset about the ECHR, and there were conversations behind doors about hauling Britain out of it. If he wanted to overshadow Sunak, you know, a couple of days into the job, he could be still here and talking about how ridiculous he thinks the whole function is.
Although also this shows you one of the advantages of being Foreign Secretary is that whenever there's a bit of domestic trouble, you're usually overseas, so people don't ask you about it.
Well, recall when Boris Johnson might have had to vote for Heathrow expansion.
Yes.
In 2018, and he conveniently found a pretext not to break his pledge to voters in Uxbridge and South Ruislip because he absolutely had to be in Afghanistan that day for crucial foreign business. Exactly. But this does sort of emphasise the role Downing Street envisions for David Cameron, which is that he is, to a greater extent than a politician who is exposed to the sort of vicissitudes of electoral politics and politics in the Commons. And I think David Cameron will be keen for this too, not least because you look at him now and think, oh, hang on, that guy... It's hard to shake the fact that guy's the Prime Minister, right? And he, not to be mean about Rishi Sunak type, but sort of physically and in terms of age, he carries, let's be blunt, a lot more gravitas than Rishi Sunak, who's been Prime Minister for 5 minutes. So I think both he and Number 10 will both be very keen for him to be doing as much foreign-facing stuff that makes the most of his stature without necessarily undermining the Prime Minister.
It's curious, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you sort of look around the cabinet table now and you think there's one bloke around that cabinet table who's won 2 general elections, and then there's a Prime Minister. You know, and from Rishi Sunak's perspective, you think, ooh, you know, people will make those kind of unflattering comparisons. But then equally, from Downing Street's perspective, you can say it takes a certain character to be willing to do that, to put somebody in the room who has that CV versus your own, and I guess brings that kind of... It was quite striking, actually, looking at the video today of when he turned up and met the Ukrainian president and was introducing the Ukrainian president to his delegation. And you think, I mean, I don't know, because I've not been to Kyiv during this conflict, and, you know, you don't see everything that isn't videoed, but he's introducing, you know, half a dozen of his delegation. And how many foreign ministers get that kind of treatment with a president, with a head of state. But now there's a foreign secretary who is a former prime minister, so that kind of value, if you like, I guess, that he can bring that you wouldn't necessarily get with someone who hadn't done that.
But to pick up on Ava's point about the European Convention on Human Rights, I noticed George Osborne, another former person from that era.
How many other podcasts are we going to mention?
There are a lot of podcasts out there. This is at 0.001% of them. But Osborne is saying in his podcast with Ed Balls, now that Cameron is in there as Foreign Secretary, withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights is going to be off the table because that's not the sort of thing he's going to want to do because he's quite kind of like, he's not as right-wing on that as many of the other members of his party.
I mean, I'm always conscious when we talk about the European Convention on Human Rights that we are at risk, but then have to be at risk of vanishing into the weeds a little bit. Because as things stand, that's not what they're advocating. Because of this idea that you sort of build a kind of ring fence, you ring fence the Rwanda project from the convention, if you can do it. Big question mark. Obviously, there's an argument from others in the Conservative Party who will say, well, that ring fence is never going to work, and so the party should get into a place where it is advocating withdrawal by the time of the next election, and that'd be a big dividing line, etc., etc. And we're still kind of in the foothills of that, aren't we? Because we still haven't seen, I say still, they only announced it yesterday, but we await, don't we, in the next days, as James Cleverly, the new Home Secretary, put it this morning, or the next couple of weeks, the details of this treaty with Rwanda, and then also what they call emergency legislation, but we can kind of, I guess, more accurately call legislation, around how they're going to try and deal with all of this stuff and see if they can make it fly.
Then, Patrick, on Wednesday night, we got the vote on the Scottish National Party amendments, which was actually in a debate about the King's speech, where the SNP were calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And how many Labour rebels were there in the end who defied the instruction to not vote for it?
There were 58
right.
MPs in total. That's a third of Keir Starmer's entire parliamentary party.
Which is a lot.
It's roughly the same proportion that rebelled over Iraq. And given that was 6 years into Tony Blair's premiership, we are not even into a Keir Starmer premiership yet. It's quite significant. Also, 8 frontbenchers forced to resign or were sacked for breaking that whip. So it's a big moment. I think it was inevitable that there would be a parliamentary confrontation on this, but clearly an uncomfortable moment for Keir Starmer, if not perhaps a massive crisis or a leadership-defining one.
And I was joking about have you finished your column, but I know you have because I got a little sneak preview of it. And you talk about what this means for if there's a Labour government after the next election and how big their majority has to be for Keir Starmer to be guaranteed to get his way on anything.
Well,
that's the significance of this.
Exactly. Well, that's the line a senior Labour MP, what you might call a Westminster wag, who retained their sense of humour despite what had just happened to me in the hour or so after that vote on Wednesday night. They said it's like that line from Jaws, we're going to need a bigger boat. Keir is going to need a bigger majority. Because one of the lessons of the past 4 weeks, and there have been lots of lessons for the Labour Party, is that individual MPs still matter. For quite a while, the sort of gripes and complaints of individual MPs and their individual political persuasions have sort of been sublimated into this looming sense that, God, we're nearly there. After 13 years, Labour could be in power again. But this is a hugely emotive issue. It's an issue that was always going to divide the Labour Party. And individual MPs and their constituencies, including ones where you'd weigh the Labour vote, including MPs who would otherwise be very loyal to Keir Starmer, have suddenly mattered. And it's exposed some deficiencies and some shortcomings in the way Keir Starmer's team have handled MPs and how they treat MPs, I think. But, I think important to retain some sense of proportion and perspective. While this has been incredibly difficult for the Labour Party, one word I haven't tried not to use, and Adam, no doubt you'll comb my columns and find I have used it, is...
Control F.
Yeah, exactly. Control F crisis, because I don't think you can call this a crisis for Keir Starmer's leadership. Yes, I think there's been a crisis of confidence among Labour with sections of its electorate, particularly British Muslims. I think most MPs would happily admit that, given the state of their email inboxes. But I don't think at any point has Keir Starmer's leadership been threatened. But it does raise questions about how the Labour Party manages its MPs and how Keir Starmer will fare when these questions crop up in government, as they inevitably will much, much more often.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's a fair point about the counterfactual from Keir Starmer's perspective. Imagine he had been an advocate of a ceasefire from the outset. and the kind of dividing line that would have created with Rishi Sunak.
And Rishi Sunak would have loved that.
Indeed. So there's that kind of thought. But then there's also one senior figure was saying to me, this was a week or two ago, actually, did Keir Starmer give sufficient thought at the very beginning of all of this, even before that interview that he did where he kind of dug a bit of a hole for himself amongst his critics within the party, talking about cutting off the power and the water
and
to
saying that Israel
Gaza.
was justified in doing that.
Exactly. Could he, so said this long-time Labour MP, have better thought through the likely arc of this whole story? So you have the horrendous attacks in Israel, followed by what was always likely to be a sustained period of attacks on Gaza that would make headlines night after night after night, in fact, for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, for all sorts of reasons who would feel that particularly keenly politically, getting more and more kind of anxious about it. And so went this argument, could he have better thought through that arc? Now, that's not to say he would have come to a different conclusion about what he was going to say. And if he was going to say what he's always said, you would have had some who would have never been able to wear it. But the argument of this person was, could he have better thought through that kind of, it sounds quite crude in the context of the horrific things we're seeing in the Middle East, but the likely trajectory of the news reporting from that region to try and keep a greater number of people on side? Question mark.
Well, one of the people who wasn't kept on side and so voted for the SNP amendment and so lost their job as a spokesperson for the party in Parliament was Jess Phillips, and she was speaking to her local radio station, BBC WM, about why she voted the way she did.
I don't feel like I am rebelling against the Labour Party. I feel like I am taking a position with my heart, my head and my constituents. There is no animosity between me and Keir Starmer. There is no... I will work every single day to ensure a Labour victory.
And Ava, what you really get from listening to Jess Phillips there is the bind, how difficult it is for an MP in a situation like this where you have a kind of conflict, as Jess Phillips was saying there, that kind of loyalty to the view that she's hearing expressed locally in her constituency versus a desire to see Keir Starmer win, and then a vote comes along where you're forced to go one way or the other, really.
Well, there's a good argument for, if you want to support Keir Starmer, you're going to have to be a Labour MP. And looking at her constituency and, the makeup of her constituency, if she were to vote against the ceasefire yesterday, there's the potential that she wouldn't be re-elected. And that's the same dilemma that Wes Streeting is now facing in Ilford North. He's got a very small majority. It's about 5,000. He once had a 10,000 majority. That's now dramatically reduced. He could potentially lose his seat over this, if people decide to really get on board with it. But going back to your point there, where you were speaking to someone who who was wondering whether Starmer had really thought about the trajectory of all of this. That's a tough word, that, especially when you've been in the cold all day. I really think that Starmer has thought about the trajectory of all of this. I think that he is lining himself up in terms of President Biden's politics. I think he is looking at himself as Prime Minister in waiting, and he has always been a leader who is focused on making a UK-US relationship better than the Conservatives have ever been able to achieve. And so he's falling in line with whatever Biden wants. And actually, if you track anything that Keir Starmer has said throughout this conflict, it falls directly in line with the Americans. So I think he's playing the long game here.
Also, I think we should be just abundantly clear. He believes it. This is what he believes is what the UK should be doing. Just obviously there's all sorts of political calculations that go into all of these kind of conversations for all sorts of people, but we should just state that obvious thing that this is what he believes.
We also haven't heard from Starmer on, he hasn't given her an acceptance letter, so there might be a potential that he writes her and says, the Labour Party is a broad church and we accept these views and, we'd actually like you to come back, because the ministerial position, or the shadow ministerial position that she has, is very well suited to her. I mean, she's the domestic abuse shadow minister.
The curious thing, I think the line that they have taken is one where to break a 3-line whip is to resign. So in that sense, that kind of happens. But I agree with you about the portfolio that she previously held, and in a curious kind of way, because of her previous expertise in that field, she can kind of carry on doing it. I'm sure radio programs and TV shows and whatever will seek her expertise in that role, and to a degree, it's almost easier because she's not coming along with having to, for as long as she is a kind of backbencher, be loyal to 1,000,001 of the party lines, which I'm sure she broadly would be anyway, but she can just go out with that kind of expertise.
Right. Another issue that has come up a couple of times now, and it is about Labour people seem to have been targeted in this way, is deepfakes. So clips that purport to show somebody like, I don't know, Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, or Keir Starmer saying something that they just didn't say, and it initially being quite believable when you look at it. Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, was the latest person to have this done to them over the weekend, and he was speaking in City Hall today. And it was interesting though, Ava, because he said, oh, the police aren't going to investigate it because it's not illegal to make a fake version of Sadiq Khan and put it online and make him say stuff he never said.
Yeah, this was a huge concern for Sadiq Khan's team last week when this video, it was going viral online. I mean, it had huge pickup. I think when I looked at it on TikTok, it had already 200,000 views. I mean, that's an enormous amount of views.
Although weirdly, I only ever see them when people are debunking them. I never see them sort of the first time round when they're purely fake. I only ever see them as like, this is a fake.
So I had it at the point where there was a commentator, a sort of internet type commentator who had, I'm trying to think of the word, duelled it? What is the word for that? I've forgotten it.
Duet stuff on
Duet,
TikTok?
that's it, sorry.
Not that I deleted it from my phone a long
That
time
is
ago
it.
because I was wasting far too much time
Not because of security
learning
concerns.
phrases like that. Yeah. Well,
What's
it's probably
duetting? Is
just-
that when you like respond to a...
Yeah, so it'll give you a little split screen. So the video will play on one side and then you'll be able to react to it in the other side of the frame.
All right.
And I was watching it and it was just before all of the cenotaph action was going to kick off on Saturday. And
It's a very tense time.
yeah, and it was someone reacting to that, basically saying like, it's terrible. It's look at the Muslim mayor. This is what he thinks of London. This is, this is who you've elected. And it was very disparaging. But look, so I work for Politics Joe, and we, on the side of the journalism we do, we also create sort of quite, what some people find them funny. We create funny videos. But to make those videos, we train AI. So we'll train an AI, we'll feed it speeches, we'll feed it interviews, and it'll be able to speak in the way of that politician. And we've done it for Jacob Rees-Mogg. We did it for our most recent video. But the responsibility that comes with that, you have to make the AI worse.
Yeah.
So that it doesn't sound exactly like the person that you're trying to
And
replicate.
do you always badge it as like, this is not real? Or do you think making it so obviously fake does the same job?
It's so obviously
Right,
fake.
okay.
Yes. I mean, what they're saying is so out of character, and it's accompanied by a load of animation. It's fake. But, you could quite easily get it to give, to do a speech and it would sound realistic.
It's journalistically, it's the single biggest thing that kind of frightens me actually about the general election campaign year that is next year, of falling for something like this. Either broadcasting something that turns out to be fake, or having an argument with a politician because I've refused to broadcast something that turns out to be real. Particularly when, if you can pull it off in a way that is believable and that might morph from a segment of a stump speech of a shadow cabinet minister or a cabinet minister in a particular part of the country during the election, where you think, were they there? Oh yeah, they were there. Were they addressing such and such? Yeah, they were. You think, oh, this is all, and then halfway through the speech, it morphs into something that isn't real. It's frightening. There were already 1,000,001 journalistic banana skins that you can slip on, and here come a whole load more. And
I think I'm maybe a bit less nervous than you, maybe because I work less than you. That's actually our workload. But I just think all our media organizations were quite used to like checking whether things are correct. So we're probably not going to be the ones that broadcast a deep fake by accident, but that doesn't, I suppose, mean that they won't end up in the ecosystem and on the social, in quite big numbers.
But the thing is, we can only check what we know is there, and this is a sort of bigger structural point, and this is something that has cropped up in a lot of my conversations with Labour people about the Gaza stuff, is that so much, I mean, obviously the whole country is listening to Newscast and other podcasts from other providers. I'm contractually obliged
And wearing
to say,
their outfits.
yeah,
while doing
indeed,
so.
indeed. But a lot of media consumption now is on encrypted platforms like WhatsApp, it's on TikTok, and for people like us who work for mainstream media organisations, that might not be part of the world we're necessarily familiar with. I've lost count the number of Labour MPs who, at some point over the past month, have brandished something at me on their WhatsApp and say, this is going round in WhatsApp in my constituency. That infamous Keir Starmer interview we were discussing earlier is one of them. Stuff that's cut in a certain way, or memes and misinformation. And for a lot of people, for what you might call, not pejoratively, low information voters who aren't necessarily mainlining politics all the time, will look at something like that and they live busy lives. It might affirm their prejudice, and they might tell them something they find shocking. But given those platforms are encrypted, how are we meant to know? We only know if MPs flag them to us.
Yeah.
Now, talking about technology, poor Michael Matheson, or is it poor Michael Matheson? First of all, who is Michael Matheson? He's the Health Secretary in the Scottish Government, and he's been in trouble because he ran up an £11,000 bill for roaming on his Scottish Parliament iPad when he went on holiday to Morocco. And then, Patrick, he didn't exactly tell the full story straight away, did he?
Now, he very bluntly said, I think it was on Monday, that there was no personal use of his iPad. It was all for parliamentary business. But earlier he gave a very emotional statement in Holyrood where he admitted that his two sons had watched football on his iPad.
Actually, should we listen to a bit of it? Because actually it was surprisingly emotional for a frontline politician.
As a parent, I wanted to protect my family from being part of the political and media scrutiny associated with this, something I believe any parent would want to do. I am a father first and foremost. I can see now that it's just not possible to explain the data usage without explaining their role. Presiding Officer, the simple truth is they were watching football matches.
Ava?
I've got some questions.
Okay, fire away.
He's a family man. Why on earth are you telling the Scottish Parliament that it was your children that did it? Why are you throwing them under the bus?
So it's unnecessary, you think?
Yes. Secondly, why on earth is your Holyrood-issued iPad with you in Morocco? That feels like a bit of a potential... Yes. Potential data.
Well, New
breach.
Year.
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, I suppose from his. I mean, I've not spoken to him about this, but I suppose he's probably thinking, you know what? I've just got to be totally and utterly candid.
Having not been for the first few days.
And so you said it all out. And I mean, I guess taking the work thing on holiday, you might think you're going to reply to some work emails and all that kind of stuff.
Do you then give it to your children? I'm not sure.
Apparently he was hotspotting, so they were using their phones, hotspotting from his iPad, and it turns out there's some change in the contract to the Scottish Parliament iPad SIM card providers, and he did not change his SIM card, despite having presumably loads of emails from IT saying you've got to change your SIM card.
But if you hotspot, that's the easiest way to extract data from someone's device. So if it was a really protected device and it had secret information on it, then you absolutely should not be hotspotting it.
You know, the thing is, I mean, obviously there's lots of political questions that he faces about, at what point he was sufficiently candid and all that kind of stuff. At a human level, it is so relatable, I think, particularly as someone with kids who like to be on devices and all that. And is it on the Wi-Fi when you're abroad and all that kind of stuff? As I say, he is understandably facing a huge amount of political scrutiny. But I think, so many people at one level or another will relate to, firstly, the fallibility, and then secondly, the family scenario of children who want to get on the internet.
Well, I can confirm I've claimed £0 for refreshments for this mug because it is completely empty. It's just a stunt mug, which you can't even buy in the Newscast shop.
Not even merch.
Mine has actually got water in it, Adam. So
Okay, I'm very jealous. And I did start off by saying this was like what we'd be doing in the pub, but I doubt you'd be drinking water. I certainly
Out of a
wouldn't.
beaker.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Newscast.
Thank you.
Good to catch up, Chris. And if you want to catch up with us, you can email us newscast@bbc.co.uk, or you can WhatsApp us on 0330 123 9480, and we'll be back with another episode of the podcast very soon. Bye.
No hesitation on reading that number out. Very impressive.
Don't try and hotspot to it though.
Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.